All right, let's get started. I'll let everybody in, or that should let everybody in, hopefully. Welcome, everyone, as we're all coming in and joining. This is our last panel of what's been a pretty fantastic fourth year of Rainbow Space Magic. And thanks to everyone for showing up, for being here, for volunteering, for fantastic conversations. This has been just wonderful. We will do it again next year after we've had lots of time to sleep and recover. This is, again, our last panel. It is How Accurate is Too Accurate? Writing Fantasy and Medieval History. And I'm KL Noone, and we also have with us Lupton and Heather O'Malley. You can drop questions in either the Q&A function or in the chat. Either way, we'll try to get to all of them. We'll try to answer them maybe as they come in, as they come up, or at the end. Of course, we have our Discord for keeping conversations going afterwards, and the recordings of our panels will be up on YouTube probably later tonight, this afternoon. Yesterday's went up pretty quickly, in fact. So I will also drop the link in there towards the end, so you can go and catch up or rewatch if you want to see us again. All right, so the first thing we'll do is have everybody say hi and introduce yourselves. Let's see, Heather, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Heather O'Malley. I've been writing for quite a while. I have a lot of stuff online in fan fiction and original superhero fiction, but my big love has always been fantasy. And for a while, I was getting a PhD in medieval history, so I studied a lot of details about the Middle Ages.
And say hi to us.
Hi, I'm Em. Emily is also fine. I write fiction under E.H. Lupton. I actually write urban fantasy for the most part. But I have a podcast. I mean, everybody has a podcast, right? But I have a podcast called Ask a Medievalist. And I call myself the ask part of the podcast. But having been medievalist adjacent for like 4 years now, I think. Um, I've just become really invested in the Middle Ages and historical accuracy and things like that. So here I am.
I love that we're a trio of medievalists and recovering medievalists. I'm KL Noone or Kristen. I publish with JMS Books. I publish a lot of historical fantasy, romance, paranormal romance, and sometimes more sci-fi. Sometimes there's superheroes. Um, Sometimes there's contemporary, but with a character who's a medieval history professor. In my day job, I also teach at a Southern California college, and I teach a lot of Shakespeare and superheroes and 12th century queer werewolf stories, which is always a good time. And I am a medievalist. My PhD program areas were medieval studies, fantasy, and adaptation in pop culture. And I'm also a member of the Robin Hood Studies Association.
Wow. Okay.
Giant nerd things. So, our first question, probably the obvious one from the panel title, but how accurate is too accurate? Is there a point at which the historical detail and the accuracy becomes too far versus what the story demands, or having fun with the creative parts? How do we approach that?
Well, one of the people who I think sometimes takes uh, information too far is like Tom Clancy. Sometimes the amount of technical data he gives is enough to actually work the system that he's talking about. And in medieval history, there's all sorts of things where you could go into absolute details about, privies and animal, how butchers worked in the Middle Ages and all of that, which may, unless your story really revolves around an adventuring butcher, I mean, I don't think it's really, some of that is necessary and gets in the way of, can get in the way of the story.
Yeah, I think that everybody has read a book where you come to a passage where the author is basically like, I did a lot of research about taxidermy for this, so buckle up, we're gonna do it. Which can be, depending on the subject, a little disturbing, right? On the flip side, we get stuff like Tolkien in The Hobbit, riddles, right? Super medieval thing. You don't have to know that to enjoy the story, but there it is. Like they do their little riddle game, um, Bilbo and Gollum, and it's great, right? It really adds a nice flavor to the fantasy world that this is a thing that they do, and it's a nice little medievalism that's right there.
Well, that's interesting. So I was thinking along similar lines. There's things that can be great little Easter eggs if you know, right? Like riddle games or character names
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, or place names. KJ Charles does this really well, especially the book that just came out, which actually isn't medieval, but it's sort of 18th century, 17th century. But all the character names are very old Anglo-Saxon things. And if you read those, you're like, I recognize this and I know that this person is probably not a good person because I get the joke to this. But yes, there's something, and I won't name it, but a very medieval fantasy that did essentially the I'm going to go on and on about, I think it was how bridges work and how bridges were built, which was interesting, but it took up multiple pages of this book and the scene just stopped and everything stopped. And so that balance of detail versus action, like, was this necessary for me to know as a reader?
Mm-hmm.
As cool as it is, and it was cool, but the entire action and the plot just stopped right there.
Yeah, like Umberto Eco is famous for scenes where he just is like, here's more information than you ever wanted to know about Church Latin in this decade. And you're just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, The Name of the Rose is an absolutely stunningly beautiful story. But my God, if I hadn't been a medieval history major when I read it, it would have absolutely crippled me because he goes into some digressions about obscure religious order, cults that got slaughtered, and you're just like, what?
Yeah. If you read through the key to the name of the rose, it has like all the heresies. And like I did not have the religious background to even understand half like why they were important at the time. Like why was this a controversial position? But wow, there's a lot in there.
Oh yeah, that thing. But he, I think he threaded an extremely fine line and occasionally crossed it, of being basically the Tom Clancy of medieval stuff.
I will say I like the opportunity to discover things. So I've been listening to Matrix by Lauren Groff as an audiobook actually. And the main character goes with her mother as a child and it's set like around, I don't know, 1130, 1128.
Hmm.
I think she gives an actual date. Um but they see like a magic trick. Not magic. It's only sort of magical realism, but like they do the woman in a box with swords trick. And it got me down this rabbit hole of like, how old is like sleight of hand magic? Like, is this like I think it's partially artistic license on Groff's part, but it is like older than I had thought, which was that most sleight of hand I considered was like a Victorian thing, and it's not. So I find that cool that like I learned something.
Well, things I love discovering is that fast food was a thing in ancient Rome. Like
Yes.
they had fast food restaurants, and you're just like, what? And then finding out that this was a thing, and they would specialize in a few things and crank them out. And I'm just like, so it's Burger King, only in Latin.
Mhm.
I was telling my Shakespeare students that a couple weeks ago. We were talking about the actual theater and what the experience would be like. And you'd come in and you'd have your nuts and you'd have your shellfish and you'd have your to-go mug of ale. Like this happened. We know this happened, when they were excavating the Rose Theater. They found all those layers of hazelnuts and shells and things. And stuff like that is so cool. Like the things that we do today. You go to the theater, you have popcorn, you have a giant overpriced thing of candy and a soda, but they're doing that too.
Mhm.
And you have these takeaway things, and they're standing in the groundling section, snacking and cheering or booing or whatever it is, the same way we do.
So I think it's worthwhile when you're writing to think about things like that, actually, like things that might draw us closer to the past, to help your reader kind of relate to the time period.
It's such a nice segue into the question you brought up when we were brainstorming questions.
Ah, yes.
But that idea about, how do we reconcile older points of view, medieval viewpoints, versus modern, the way that we look at the past versus how someone else would experience it, especially things like, magic, the sacred, the secular.
Mhm.
How do we approach that?
Well, like one of the immediate things that always comes to mind with this is the Tiffany problem. You know, medievalists know that Tiffany is a medieval name. I mean, it's a shortened form of what Theophany,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and so they're like, oh, it's Tiffany. It's no big deal. But you put that in a medieval book, and you will get someone will set fire to you on the internet because they'll be like, that was not a name, and you'll be like, ah, yeah, no, really, it is. I'm sorry, but we have to juggle what's accurate with what people's misperceptions are. Because if you cross those misperceptions, the reader will be kicked out because they don't understand the accuracy you're actually portraying because their conception of it is separate. Like the link between the sacred and the profane in medieval society. I mean, there was constantly having feast days. I
Mhm.
mean, it was feast day after feast day after feast day. And yet people don't really get that nowadays. And so if you throw in, oh, it's another feast, they'll be like, do these people do anything but?
Feast days, fast days. That's what the
Mhm.
calendar looks like.
Yeah. On the other hand, and this is something that has bothered me about high fantasy. I don't know about you guys. The traditional, like tavern scene with like men drinking and wenches and whatever. Like it's a very patriarchal view of the world. And I think sometimes it can be worthwhile to challenge that and be like, yeah, there were trans people. There were, well, I mean, like, we don't know how they considered themselves, but by modern standards, we might consider them trans or queer or whatever. Like that people like that could have existed in the past. That like bring a more rounded or less colonized view of history to fantasy fiction.
And that's something that historians, I think a lot of contemporary historians are working on. There has been a lot of work on kind of pre-modern sexualities. There was the great trans-historical medieval from what, 2 years ago, and I was trying to remember the author and I can't. And if I think of it, I'll put it in the chat. but there's people actively doing that work to rewrite those histories a little bit. And of course, for so many of our medieval authors, they're writing fantasy, right? Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of England has King Arthur and Merlin and dragons. I mean, realism is not baked into the genre here.
Right.
And we're having fun with it. We're having fun from the beginning. If you're looking at some of the medieval romances and the adventures of Arthur at the Turnwathalin, Arthur goes riding and the ghost of Queen Guinevere's mother comes up from the lake to yell at him for being a bad husband. Like, medieval writing and medieval romance embraces the weird and the strange and the different and the magical. So if we're writing fantasy and we want to throw ghosts in there or dragons or whatever else we want, we're being very true to the spirit of the medieval. That was almost a really good pun with ghosts.
Oh yeah. But also like things, apparently snails were a big threat in medieval times based off of the writing on the in the books. You have these little art scenes where snails are attacking peasants and they're like, "Oh no." These giant snails or rabbits. Rabbits are just vicious in those medieval texts. And you're just like, and but throwing in details like that might throw people. And but like for me, I've been in the book I just finished that came out today. I studied a lot of medieval armor, medieval weapons. I tried to pick a time period and I stuck with whatever was available in that time period. And then I tried to make sure everything else was contemporaneous from there. I'm like, they need this armor to have this armor. It means this time period. That means these things are going on. And, that actually gave me a lot of stuff to work with and made my writing easier because I know what farming practices were happening in the 1430s and what armor was prevalent in that time period, what weapons, what tactics, what ways of farming and stuff were. So
Well, that's actually really interesting. I'll turn that one into a question. It does having the historical data and the facts and that sort of knowledge make the writing part easier in some ways. But before I ask you that, I will say you brought up snails because you knew about my snails short story, right? um, the one that one of my short stories with JMS books is a medieval story that's called The Snails of Dunnas, and they do fight giant snails. It's actually there's a non-binary character who's part fairy as well, but they do go and fight giant snails. So thank you for letting me share that one. But
you're welcome.
back to that question. So does having that sort of historical knowledge in some ways maybe make the writing easier because you have that knowledge and you have those anchors for the story?
Well,
I guess I'll jump in. Yes. I mean, I care a lot about place, I think. Probably all writers care about place, but like one thing that I felt like helped my writing improve a lot was trying to connect with places on a much deeper level and think about not just like differing geographies, but like um just like a way of like grounding your work. And then you have the characters who do things, and sometimes things might slip in that are a little bit modern or not, but I feel like sometimes if you can ground your stuff very well in the era that you're writing about, that people will kind of forgive it because they'll be like, oh, that one person was, weird, or they change, like they changed the language to make more sense to us as modern people. There's like that HBO cowboy show, Deadwood, where they changed all of the swears that people would do to just saying the F word because it made more sense to a modern audience to swear that way instead of, 1890s swears. But
I think that's a missed opportunity, though. I mean, they could have really had some absolute fun with it because swears are obvious not just by the words, but by the tone. And all of those actors were really skilled and they could have conveyed a lot with just the tone. But I get the urge to sometimes change things because you have to consider your audience when you are grounding your story in a certain time period. Like I am aware that a large chunk of my audience probably is not aware of you know metallurgy in the 1400s in France and Germany, and even then it becomes regional by various places, or that there were seals and stuff on barrels of beer where the town crier would verify that it came from a certain brewery, and so there was the king seal, the town crier's seal, the brewery seal. So there's all these things on the barrel of beer just besides the tap. And a lot of people wouldn't know that. So I mean, would they buy that detail, or would they just glaze right past it? You know.
It sort of comes back to that question of like, what does your reader actually need to know for that scene? What's going to be useful for that scene? And maybe your point of view character thinks really hard about it. Like they're a brewer and they need to know, or they're an inspector and they need to know, but maybe they don't. I suppose the flip
Yeah.
side of that is, since we are also a fantasy panel, how do you approach the fantasy part? What kinds of creative licenses do you take? Are there some challenges to that, or is it just pure fun?
The story that just came out, Hands of the Morai, it's kind of a very familiar medieval setting, but it's different sets of gods, it's a different place, and so there's no elves or dwarves, and magic is only divine magic and not, anything else. And so that becomes, yeah, I'm able to use a lot of touchstones from how the medieval church in Western Europe was, and so how they approached things and viewed things, and variations between different sects and how that changes how the characters interact with different religious orders.
um oh, I tend to write. I'm really good at getting my characters into a problem and getting very stressed out about it, and then remembering, oh yeah, there's supposed to be magic. Maybe we can solve this problem with magic. Like forgetting as I'm writing that I'm writing fantasy, and then reminding myself. So I don't know. I feel like the fantasy part often sort of comes up spontaneously, or it's like some of it is like wish fulfillment. Like I wish that I could go to a place and like kind of feel all of the history of the place, and so I'll write that in. And like it, it's a fantastical element, but it's also like just me being like, man, this place is so old, I wish I knew more. I wish I could feel that. So
And playing with possibilities, and what if the folklore and the history and the myths were all simultaneously true to some extent?
yeah.
Yeah. And playing with maybe those blurry boundaries, especially when thinking about medieval literature and history. What if the elves were real? What if the fairies were real? What if they weren't very happy with us? What if they were still around? Like in Patricia McKillip's Kingfisher, which has King Arthur sort of showing up, at least the knights show up. Um, or Peter David's Nightlife, which has Arthur wake up in 1980s New York. which is not a great place to wake up if you're, a medieval king. Um,
I feel like we should mention Neil Gaiman's, is it Chivalry, right?
yes.
Where the woman finds the Holy Grail in a charity shop. I saw him read it live like last year. It's an excellent short story. But
That one's such a lovely story, and they just did that illustrated edition of it too. But that's such a good intersection of what if you were an elderly woman who bought the Holy Grail at a local charity shop? What would you do with it? And I don't want to spoil the ending, but I think her choice is absolutely the right one, and it's one that feels right.
mm-hmm.
I was thinking about the problem of magic as well. When I was working on Magician, which is very medieval, well, it's sort of early modern. We've barely invented the printing press, so we can print things. But part of the problem is that our main character is super powerful. He's trying not to do a lot of magic because if he does, he'll change the world by doing things. What if you can do things like change the seasons or the rain or the crops? That affects whole kingdoms and it'll destabilize things. So, how do you approach things like the magic systems in your writing?
Well, for me, in Hands of the Morai, not necessarily in other things, but in that story in particular, because I chose that there's different faiths, and each faith has its own sort of prayer-based magical systems. They all have different areas that they focus in, but still you can have these clerics using powerful prayers against each other in combat, and that could get really messy. And so the regular characters who are all basically they work for a goddess, and so they're kind of like the Knights Hospitaller or Knights Templar, only not really, since it's an all-female company. And they talk about how they hate it when that happens, when clerics get involved in battle because it gets really messy really fast, and they prefer a nice clean, let's just fight it out.
I think magic is interesting because right, like for the reasons that have been mentioned, um like what makes Superman an interesting character, right? Like how do you come up with a bad guy who can challenge him? Or like, like the interesting things for me anyway. I'm not going to pretend that like I'm a Superman buff or whatever, but the things I always felt were cool about Lex Luthor were like political machinations that Superman wouldn't just be able to like punch his way out of and stuff like that. Um, so like with magic, you can be like magic is as powerful as you want it to be. Um, but then you still have the problem of like what's preventing Gandalf from just taking the ring and like chucking it in the volcano himself if he has we only see him use his magic a little bit, right? In the thing, but we get the feeling that he has much more powers than we see displayed. And I think like so for me personally solving the problem um was to look at like magic as both something that was like culturally embedded so that there were different types of magic, as Heather also talked about, that like different cultures might have their own things and this is just one thing, and also that there could be like a process of discovery for the characters within that, like this is like nobody knows everything, everybody's kind of learning as they go along. We have books of like more or less reliability and we're sort of figuring it out because I'm figuring it out.
I like that. We're all sort of figuring it out. how do we do this?
my entire life.
Sometimes you just
Just
sit
all
down.
muddling through.
Well, one of the things I was really impressed with, because I've done a read through of The Lord of the Rings, looking specifically for instances of magic.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of them, but it's always something subtle, something, like the big moments are the healing of Theoden and, dealing with Saruman. I mean, when
Mhm.
it's just two of them, basically they're trying to use their willpower against each other. And so, and then you have like the File of Galadriel, the Light of Arendelle, which he uses against Shelob, that Frodo uses against Shelob. And these are, they don't really, they sort of solve problems, but they don't really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not all powerful, but it can make a huge difference at times. And, I think that's much more fun with magic, is it's not the big, fix all and cure all of every issue. It can be, a problem in and of itself that, might
Mhm.
make things worse.
It's the ethical question, right? If I have this power, how do I use it? How do I best use it? Do I help and heal and protect, which seems to be where the good magic is for Tolkien? Healing people, guiding, making light, versus control and power and the One Ring. I actually did wear my elf pin. It seemed appropriate.
A leaf of Lorien does not
Yep.
idly fall.
Gotta dress for the part. So we've been talking about authors that we might recommend, in terms of the Tolkien, the Neil Gaiman. Are there other authors that you would recommend as a good blending of that kind of medievalism and fantasy?
Mercedes Lackey does some good stuff. Her biggest issue is there's a lot of things that are the same. I mean, you start off farther in the future than that. You go back and, she gets more in detail about medieval markets and stuff like that, which I thought was absolutely wonderful. Uh, and, so she's really good at kind of blending the fantasy elements and the medieval elements really well.
I just find
Uh,
that one really funny because I've said that to my husband. Like, I love Mercedes Lackey and I will buy all the books, but there's a point at which they all have kind of the same plot arc. Like, young protagonist gets powers, learns to use them, explores the world, does something heroic. Like, they're good, but the plot all kind of sounds the same. But it's gorgeous world building and so immersive.
mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I feel like I should plug Terry Pratchett, who probably does not need to be plugged, but I recently read some of his Tiffany Aching books aloud to my 6-year-old. And he just went out and named one of his characters Tiffany, I think intentionally because of the Tiffany problem, that he had heard of that and was like, no, we're doing this.
Oh, definitely. He said
But also
so.
they read aloud really well. So they're a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, definitely Terry Pratchett. He's amazing.
Mhm.
Especially as the transition from the first books, as more technology comes through and you get the moving away from the older fields, pastoral life to more industrial,
Yeah.
and he covers that really well.
It is over the course of like 40 books. So, we should all
That's
get
why
the
it's done
chance
really
to
well.
write such a rich canon.
Oh
The fact
yeah.
that you move from the early books are so clearly satire and parody, things
Mhm.
like Cohen the Barbarian and so on. But then they, especially towards the middle and then the end, they get very, very serious about things like guns or death or how we face death or war, or gender and expected gender roles. and then how you deal with new technology and things like steam power and how that changes things, or class issues. Like watching Pratchett evolve as a writer is so much fun.
Yeah.
I'll
Plus, he's
also
just really funny. I gotta say, like, one time finishing, I think I was reading Weird Sisters in the corner of a bagel shop, and I was glad that I was facing the street because I was just like dying of laughter. So
one of my early academic publications was partly about Weird Sisters, about Shakespearean fantasy.
perfect.
Um, I'll also throw in Peter Beagle's The Last Unicorn,
Oh,
which
yes.
it's such gorgeous fantasy medievalism, and it's also one that plays with, in some ways, kind of very, very affectionate parody. You get the Captain Cully interludes in the woods where they know they're not Robin Hood, and they're sort of, there's an underlying sadness about it, like we're not these great heroes, we're pretending, or Schmendrick as the magician who should be great but isn't. It's a gorgeous book in its own right, but it's also a really lovely kind of interrogation of what it means to love the Middle Ages and to love some of those stories in that world, and some nostalgia for it, but nostalgia in the sense of you actually wouldn't want to live there because it's not real, right? But that was such a gorgeous book. Um, Things like Diane Duane's early books, right? The Door into Starlight and things like that, which are extremely kind of high medieval fantasy, gorgeously queer polyamorous fantasy. At one point, there's like 8 people in a marriage, and half of them aren't human. One of them's a dragon.
Nice.
Okay,
Oh, those
cool.
are so good. Um, if you've only read Dan Duane's young adult series, like the Say You Want to Be a Wizard, go find The Tale of the Five, The Door into Fire, The Door into Starlight, all of those. They're just absolutely fantastic and full of all kinds of weird queer polyamory, sometimes marriage for political reasons, but then they actually like each other. But then sometimes one of them is a fire elemental, and especially in the first book, the core of it has a lot to do with grief and also living up to parental expectations. I mentioned Peter David earlier. You know, Nightlife is the one that has King Arthur waking up in New York City and deciding that he should be president because he was King Arthur. And it's definitely played for broad comedy, but it is very funny. Peter David wrote Star Trek novels for a long time, but also wrote for a lot of comics. He's writing Aquaman for a long time. What else would I recommend? Evangeline Walton's Mabinogion novels, if you want kind of Welsh and Celtic mythology. Those are utterly gorgeous. Retellings of the Welsh, Celtic myth cycle. I feel like there's a whole bunch of things on my shelves, and I could just go on about.
See, that just makes me think of Lloyd Alexander,
Ooh, that's another good one.
because the Terran the Pig Keeper
Mhm.
series is a great variant of some of the Mabinogion stories,
Mhm.
and it's just absolutely stunning, and has the most terrifying Disney movie of all time, because the Black Cauldron is so good, but is so scary.
It's not a kids movie, and any of our audience, like if you want to go watch Disney's The Black Cauldron, well, it's appropriate. It's October. It's a good time for it.
It is a good time for it, and it's a good movie and with great characters, but man, it's not friendly to kids. I know a lot of kids who ended up, like, I thankfully had read the whole series, so I knew what to expect going in. But without that, oh man, there were some nightmares.
I feel like it's hard to say that one's a kids movie. I mean, it's meant to be, but oh boy.
Oh yeah.
Sort of back to the research question. We're doing okay on time for about 10 minutes. But I did want to ask in terms of doing the research, the medievalism, world building, what's the most surprising or the most fun bit of research that you've done or something that stands out?
I looked a lot into medieval cobbling, how shoe repair was done in the Middle Ages. And so that had to get into how shoes were made and what tools were used and how people went about that. And that was actually kind of fascinating, and I found that really interesting. And it's just a skill that the main character brings with them when they join up with the mercenary group, the religious order. And so, they actually repair a couple of people's shoes during the course of it.
It seems like such a useful skill, right? Like you're a mercenary troop, you're going on long marches. You want someone who can repair your shoes.
I would say we don't have enough shoe repair in the US actually. Like there was I had a sandal that got broken when I was walking around in China, and there was just like a shop by the side of the road that had like a sign up that said repair shoes. He like looked at the strap and like nailed it back together, and it was great. Like
Oh yeah, some of it is like so simple.
mm-hmm.
And or oh, the problem here is the lacing broke. Well, we can just redo the lacings, and then I can just treat it so the waterproofing goes back into effect. And you're just like, it was really that easy. Cobblers were made a lot of money because it was a super useful skill.
Okay. We just did a podcast about this, so it's been in my head. One thing that I really enjoyed about the Middle Ages in general is that if you go into a lot of old churches and stuff, and you look at all like the carvings, and there's like some traditions in different places, but um where you'll just see like butts carved into the crenellations and stuff. And like what I really enjoy is this idea is the changing idea of what counts as obscenity, right? So that um there's like that, I think it was like the Dutch tradition of having like the little guy at the back of a creche scene who's like pooping in the
Mhm.
background.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like all of these things that like were apparently fine in the Middle Ages, and then you get like sort of the late early modern to Victorian, probably Victorians mostly, who were like, oh no, we don't know what to do with that. And like so I like the reaching back and like um so I think if you get really excited and want to know about obscenity, like if you go to our my podcast website, we link to a bunch of websites that have photographs of all of the decorations. But like this turns out to be like weirdly common. Maybe not weirdly. Maybe it's
No,
just like
no.
my modern brain being like, why would there be like a butt carved in among the leaves in the church? But like somebody got bored or they were having fun when they were carving it or whatever. But yeah, that will never do me any good when I'm writing, I don't think. But there you go.
I mean, you never know. There might be a story about the
That's
bust in the church.
And also, there's like, you know, graffiti is is all over the place.
yes.
Like, I think one of my favorites is in the Hagia Sophia, up by the ceiling. There's this Germanic, this
Yes.
stuff carved in there, and they're like, oh, it must be some deeply symbolic thing or what. They get up there, and it is effectively Sven was here.
Yeah. Like Vikings got everywhere and
Oh
they
yeah.
carved on everything.
Well, I mean, for a while, Vikings were the primary guards of the emperors in the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they were all over that town.
Yeah.
Byzantium. And so, yeah, they were in the Hagia Sophia and they could just do things like Sven was here.
Yeah, there's old graffiti in a I think a tomb in the Orkney Islands. And like the best one was like I'm the tallest one here and I carved my name near the top. And you're just like humans have been humans like forever.
Yes, and like for me, I one of the things I like to bring in is the earthiness of it. Is people made out on the side of the road. People kept walking by.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody said anything, nor did it really offend them. They were just like, "Oh, okay, whatever," and just keep moving on. And so the very basics of life were just accepted, and nothing was about just living was considered really all that profane.
Which leads me to one of the things I was looking up for not speculative fiction, but for contemporary story, but about fashion and late medieval, early modern fashion and things like cod pieces. And we were totally fine with, walk around with your giant cod piece out, but the ribbons that you had sewn on it would indicate how large your cod piece was, and you'd be very proud of that. And of course, some men would add extra ribbons that they did not perhaps need in order to make that look larger. So I've been doing a lot of fun research into sort of sumptuary laws and what you were allowed or not
Yeah.
allowed to wear, but how that functions as ways to present yourself in public. How what do I want to look like? How do I want to show off? This imported fur or the multiple 12 ribbons dangling down towards my knees, or the extra long toes on the feet, the long shoes that you have to tie up.
Yeah.
But then you get the response to that, and I'm finding that tension really interesting, like the movement to then regulate that tension between the the excess and the extravagance, but then the need for social order and trying to reestablish that. Like all the laws that get passed about who could and couldn't wear certain shades of purple, or who could and couldn't wear certain types of fur, and it gets so detailed, down to
Oh
just
yeah.
very, very specific. And I do find that fascinating. 99% of it never went into that story, but knowing it was so fascinating. And there's a little satisfaction of, okay, I got that fact right when this character is giving a lecture to students about this.
Just to add to our list of medieval stuff, on that note, I think we should mention Blackadder.
Oh yeah.
Because they
Yes.
definitely they did the scene where he goes out to buy a fur robe and like he says it's ermine, but because of sumptuary laws, like he comes back and it's like it's got she's like, oh, it's flat. They left the collars on. I think that's season 3. And of course the medievalists favorite films of Life of Brian and Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Oh yeah.
um Personally, there will never be a better scene in a film than the Roman soldier making Brian paint the corrected graffiti on everything, making him conjugate the Latin.
It's like Romane eum dominum.
Yes.
I had a teacher who in Latin when I was taking medieval history as an undergrad, who he was Cajun and he loved that scene. And so he did the scene, and he wrote it because he thought it was absolutely hysterical and thought all of us students would find it funny too. I knew Life of Brian, so I'm cackling, and other students are there like, this is Latin class, right? I don't know what's going on.
But you're learning how to properly conjugate.
Okay, Romans go home.
Oh, and I showed my students a few years ago. I haven't actually done it for a while, but we did Men in Tights. which
Oh,
was
great
just
film.
fantastic. And a lot of them hadn't ever seen it. And I got to introduce it to them, and they found it absolutely hysterical, which made me happy.
Nice.
It is about that time. We've managed to talk for 50 minutes. So I will just do the last sort of wrap up question, which is what are you working on now and where can people find you?
I am working now on a kind of a magical realism romance story called Message Forward. Uh, and I can be found online at Heather K. O'Malley on Facebook and soon at hkolit.com.
Let's see. I have a poem next month. Well, it's issue 33, so it should come out in like the next couple of weeks of Paranoid Tree. It's like a real cute little zine. Like they fold them up. It's like a little octavo or something. Um I should have brought my contributor copies down because it just came and it looks super pretty. It's like one illustrated poem per issue. So there's that. This is my book that came out in May. Whoops. The sun. Um Dionysus in Wisconsin, and it's actually it's not contemporary. It's set in 1969. But compared to the Middle Ages, it's contemporary. And the sequel comes out probably in January of 2024. And you can find me at ehlupton.com. And I put all of my links in the shameless self-promotion Discord channel. And
Oh,
I should
yes.
mention my podcast is Ask a Medievalist. We're at askamedievalist.com. And we are in most podcast apps. I think we had a fight with like Google Podcasts or something, but someday I'll learn SSL and get that taken care of. But that day is not today. I'm not a networking person, but someday
Someday. Quests for the future.
quest to get a
And
SSL certificate.
and I'm KL Noone. Let's see, what am I working on? The sequel to the early medieval snails story with our mercenary swordsman and non-binary half-fairy partner. The short story sequel to that will actually be out October 21st. I don't have buy links yet, but it's called In the Pass of Ghosts, and they are appropriately going to face some ghosts for Halloween. Let's see, what else? Earlier, a couple months ago, the next novel in the sort of high fantasy world that is the world of magician, which I'll wave at you. But the follow-up novel to that just came out. It's not out in paperback yet, but that one's called Apprentice's Luck, and that came out with JMS Books. What am I currently working on? Uh, the other thing that I'm doing is actually revising my very first novel, which I got the rights back to, so I'm going to republish that probably by the end of the year with a lot of reworking and a new epilogue. And then K.S. Murphy and I are working on the third Regency Magicians novel sometime, ideally in the first half of next year, so we can get that finished off. Well, lots of things. And I am, let's see, I am KL Noone over on Blue Sky, Kristen Noone on the soon to be defunct Twitter, also on Facebook. On Instagram, I'm Greenwood Outlaw. If you want a lot of cat pictures or craft beer pictures, sometimes book related things. And all of the book info is out there on my JMS Books author page or on Amazon or on my website, which I keep forgetting to update, so it's terribly out of date now. But most things are up there. So you can go and find me in all of those places. And we are about 5 minutes over. So I will go ahead and pause there, but we are just about done. Thank you for coming to our last panel. We will turn things over to Monique for last words, wrap ups, saying farewell to everyone, and thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for joining us this weekend. It's been wonderful, and I really appreciate your participation and joining us and all of this. I've really had a good time, and I hope everybody else has as well. I've already posted the link to the recordings for the panels from yesterday in the Discord. Today's panels should be up maybe today, maybe tomorrow. We'll see. I am taking a break from the computer when we're done here. Yeah, and then the readings will be up in the next few days as well. We'll have a survey out in the next little while to see what people thought of it, and yeah, all of that sort of thing. So thank you again, and that's it for this year. All right. Thank you.
Yay.
And thank you for organizing, everyone.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes.
It's a pleasure.
Amazing.
I'm looking forward to 5.
I was going to say,
Yes.
do we have any information yet as to if somebody wants to volunteer, what do they do, Monique?
They email me at rainbowspacemagic@gmail.com. And, so definitely, yeah, and we'll do some sort of debrief in a couple weeks, and we'll probably look at getting together, and people who want to help organize next year, probably within the next 6 months, so in the spring. Okay,
Sounds good.
thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey.